Thank you, everyone, here and on Zoom or whatever our method of choice is these days. It's a privilege, as I said, to be able to trespass in 20th century scholarship. It's, as some of you know, not where you usually see me. And in a way, when I was thinking about putting this lecture together, it was a little bit of a paralysis, if I can put it that way. Here we are in a moment where there's so many different stories, right? Everybody's hearing different stories, and they're hearing the stories that they want to hear. There are so many stories about the history of modernism in the 20th century, and I have been very selective about what you're going to hear today. And I want to start off by saying that you should hear all the other stories too. So as Paige said, this lecture is the first in a series of lectures that are planned in conjunction with this exhibition, currently on view in our Gun Gallery exhibition space. How many of you have already seen it? A lot. That's very good. Go see it again. And as I was implying, modernism is a really slippery subject. It's one that eludes precise definition. It eludes precise definition now, and it even eluded it in its own time. And one of the most prominent people to try and say what modernism was Alfred Barr, who was the first director of the Museum of Modern Art, a Harvard-educated art historian who offered one of the first university classes ever taught on modern art at Wellesley College in 1926. And then he was tapped to lead the Museum of Modern Art when it was founded in 1929. And that institution has played a key role in whatever we call modernism ever since its founding in 1929. Being shown at MoMA is really the mark of somebody who's arrived. It's interesting to me that Barr published something in 1945, so almost 20 years after the founding of the museum. What is modern art? And I don't think, in a way, we've ever really decided what it is. We're still arguing about it. And scholars are still arguing, for example, about when did modernism start anyway? It's a slippery subject. And some people feel that it arrived with the invention of photography. The first photography in 1839, which in a way released visual artists from representation. You could take a picture now with ever-increasing ease throughout the 19th century, which in a way released artists from having to reproduce the natural world if they so chose. Is that the beginning of modernism? Or is it somebody like Whistler, who explained that art should just exist for art's sake? It didn't have a role other than creating beauty, creating a mood, and is that our first idea of modern art? Or Impressionist scholars would tell you that modernism starts with Impressionism, when artists began to move away, if I can say it that way, from a mirror-like reproduction of landscape, for example, like in the Monet that you see at lower right, and instead began to think about things that have to do with the object that they were making itself. How are the colors arranged over the surface of the composition? What's the brushwork like? What handwriting, if I can put it that way, does each individual artist have in the way they apply their brushwork? Is that when modern art starts? Well, the conventional sort of let's start our art history class in this moment definition often begins with these two really important exhibitions. The Armory show that was held in New York, in Boston, believe it or not, and in Chicago in 1913, or the Grafton Gallery, Monet, and the Post-Impressionist show that was held in London over the course of 1910-11. These were instrumental shows that introduced the most contemporary art to audiences in those two major capital cities. They included an interesting roster of artists, as you can see in these cover designs for the exhibition catalogs. We might not necessarily call Monet a modernist right now, unless you were a Monet scholar, in which case you would. And I would remind you that most people think being modern is a good thing, so we all want our artists to participate in that movement. Monet, Cézanne, Gauguin, Van Gogh, Matisse, they don't sound exactly like the list of modernists that we might choose today. We might think of Braque and Picasso instead. These shows did shift the work of many young artists, and I'm showing you on the left a very early work by Charles Sheeler in a private collection, and on the right a work by the British artist Roger Fry, who was one of the organizers of the Grafton Gallery's exhibition, and just because I feel I need to say this, he was John Singer Sargent's arch nemesis. You can see that already these two artists were very influenced by the work of modern French painters like Matisse, like Braque, who divided up the landscape in different ways. These are not mimetic landscapes. Instead, they're views that take into account feeling and the experience of the artist in that landscape themselves, breaking up the forms into faceted views, or on the right, something that's perhaps a little more related to Cézanne, the patchwork view of the landscape. These are what the young artists were doing who were affected by the shows of the Armory show and the Grafton show, but they were hardly the only ones to proceed in a new direction. There were other people, most notably André Breton, who felt that modernism was something else altogether. Breton was a French writer and poet. He published a surrealist manifesto in 1924, which was political in intent and directed at both literature and the visual arts, in a way influenced by the nihilism that came out of World War I and the psychoanalytic theories of figures like Sigmund Freud. Breton argued that art should not reflect just the visual world, but the world of the mind, to accept the power of unconscious thought and dreams, and to make real what you cannot touch. By the mid-20th century, there were so many different ideas about what art could be, should be, and how it got there, that even Alfred Barr had difficulty explaining it. And it's his chart that you see on the left that goes off into 16 million different directions and shows how all of these different movements in Barr's mind related to one another. And I hope you can see that a lot of these arrows go in both directions. And today we study Barr himself as a critic, as a figure, as the founder of MoMA, acknowledging his perspectives and his own limitations. As capacious as his ideas and his exhibitions were, especially for their time, doing shows of primitive art, of art from Mexico, of what was then called Negro art in the 20s and 30s, he very much, as you can see from this chart, held on to a very Eurocentric idea of what modernism should be, and he left a lot of people out. If you look at the names of artists he included, we don't see figures of very important Black artists. We don't see women. By the mid-20th centuries, just to take one medium, painting, it could be approached in enormously different ways. All three of the paintings that you see on the screen were made in 1940. All of them are modern. They're very, very different from Lois Malou Jones on the left, who did this self-portrait in a sort of expressionist vocabulary, confrontational, looking both at us and at herself. George L.K. Morris at the center, who doesn't do representation at all. His work is called composition and really is an arrangement of flat forms and color, or the sort of hyper-realism narrative quality of an artist like Norman Rockwell. Well, most of us have been taught over the years that the history of modern art culminates and really flourishes in the mid-century with the school of abstract expressionists, represented for you here by Jackson Pollock on the left, the MFA's early Pollock from 1945 called Troubled Queen, in which the little bit that you can see, if I can get it, of a face and a figure, Troubled Queen, has been completely subsumed by Pollock's energetic brushwork and the beginning of his drip style, or on the right by David Smith, whose cockfight variation from the same year you see on the right. This is what we've been told is modernism. The triumph of American painting is even a book about abstract expressionism. This is the story that we've all been led to believe is the continual progression of modern art. What you might not know is this is a story that was, shall we say, emphasized by an organization that you might not think had much to do with the arts, the CIA. Some of you will know, some of you will remember that art plays a huge role in nationalism and in communication about which national system is the best. And the CIA played an important role in promoting abstract expressionism in exhibitions that were exhibited around the world. New American Painting, for example, the catalog that you see on the left, sponsored by MoMA, went to 8 European countries in the late 1950s. And just to remind you, this is the Cold War moment. This is the moment where two great systems of politics and culture are being proposed as the wave of the future. The Soviet way on the left and the American way on the right. And I think in this photograph you see the contrast between them, the figurative, solid forms of Soviet realism on the right, which was promoted as not the system we want to get involved with. You can't think of anything that's more opposite to that kind of painting than Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning. And the CIA embraced that freedom of brushwork as indicative of the freedom of the American system. So you can see that it played a political role. Its rise as the story we've all been told is very much a tool not only of the promotion of certain artists over others, but also a political tool of the Cold War, which I find absolutely fascinating. It's a century that's bounded by war, not just a Cold War, but of course World War I and World War II, and also of an incredible change, a change between trench warfare, people who looked at each other as they engaged in warfare, to something that was much more distant. And I'm just reminding you of the atomic explosion of Hiroshima that you see at the lower center, to remind you of the atomic age that plays a role here, a time that could be considered as one of great destruction, but also one of promise. The atomic age, we remember the Jetsons. Everything was supposed to be good. I don't know what happened. I push a button at home and no food comes out. It's also the 20th century is incredible change. I think we've seen incredible change in our own lifetimes too, but remember the 20th century is a century that starts with horses and ends with planes, and that's pretty amazing. Changes in architecture, the whole Art Deco style. Changes in housing. I'm showing you Levittown from the 1950s at lower left. Changes in transportation, from airways to cars and highways, and changes in lifestyle, entertainment now brought into your home through television, and of course, how could I resist, huge changes in women's fashion. So what I decided to do over the course of this lecture is really to think about modernism in a kind of ruthless way, and I'm going to put the rest of our time together in the world of the two artists that we're showing in the Gunn Gallery, Georgia O'Keeffe and Henry Moore. I'm showing you two early abstractions by each of them here, and even though they're 10 years apart in date, I hope you'll see that since Moore was 10 years younger than O'Keeffe, these were actually made at the same moments in their lifetimes. So a very early adoption of turning away from what might be considered realism into abstraction, but both rooted in nature, with O'Keeffe's Evening Star on the left, an incredible watercolor that some of you may have seen at the Museum of Modern Art last year, and on the right, Henry Moore's View of a Bird. I've chosen for this talk 3 moments and 3 different media to explore modernism that I hope will offer some kind of background and context for our exhibition. Artists whose stories seem to me, at least, to be key to understanding the works of O'Keeffe and Moore. You'll be hearing about O'Keeffe and about Moore in later lectures in this series, so I'm not going to discuss their careers here, but I will circle back to them in my 3 examples. And I want to start with the artists of the so-called Stieglitz circle. And you see here Stieglitz's self-portrait on the right from 1911, and one of his most famous photographs on the left of the Flatiron Building in New York, which he made in 1903. So we're really at the beginning of the 20th century here. Stieglitz, who lived from 1864 to 1946, was obviously a photographer. He believed in photography as a fine art, and this was a real war that was going on in cultural circles at this time. Is photography the product of a machine, or is it something that could be defined as fine art? And there were camps on both sides. Some people say, especially when it got to Kodak's famous advertisement, "You push the button, we do the rest," that photography did not have an art component. But Stieglitz was firmly in the other camp. He believed not only in photography as being worthy of being considered as fine art and exhibited and collected as fine art, he also believed that non-manipulated photographs, in other words, what's called straight photography, was just as artistic as photographs that had been enhanced in the darkroom, for example, by adding color to a gum that would make the final print, or had been manipulated with a brush or by hand. Stieglitz didn't do any of that. He chooses a different way to make you see this incredibly tall, weird building that you might not like very much in an artistic way. How does he do it? He photographs it during a snowstorm. He puts a tree in front of it, pushing it back in the composition and allowing nature to take a major role. It's carefully balanced, not only in terms of the way the forms are arranged on his sheet, but also in the tonality of colors that he gets out of black and white. Stieglitz went on to make works that are even more abstract. This is one of his series that he called equivalents. They're cloudscapes. cloudscapes that center on shapes and the balance of light and dark. They are evocative, and in Stieglitz's mind and in the mind of many of his colleagues, they were the visual equivalents of the effect upon you from listening to a piece of music. It's a way to get at something ineffable, something that you feel in addition to seeing it. And that's an approach that we'll see again. Stieglitz maintained that these photographs, these equivalents, were the culmination of everything that he had learned about photography in the previous 40 years. But Stieglitz wasn't just important for his photographs. He was a publisher, a gallerist, an impresario, and he made unparalleled contributions to the introduction of European modern art into the United States, and he also gave unequivocal support to young American modernist painters. I'm showing you here one of his first galleries, which was called 291. You might guess that was the address, 291 Fifth Avenue, where he showed his own work, but also exhibitions that he organized. The official name of the space was the Little Galleries of the Photo Secession. So you can already see the importance of photography as a medium in his exhibition program. But 291 is what everybody ended up calling it, and it became the preeminent center for the exhibition, as I said, of modern European and American artists. I'm showing you here on the right two of his early shows in the teens, the work of the French sculptor Brancusi at the upper right, and at the lower right, an American sculptor influenced by Brancusi, but also by American folk art, Ellie Nottleman, in 1916. He went on to have two other galleries, an intimate gallery, which he founded in 1925, and another one called An American Place that opened in 1929. And Stieglitz continued to be critical in promoting the works of the artists he supported, who included Georgia O'Keeffe, Arthur Dove, Marston Hartley, John Marin, Charles Demuth, and the photographer Paul Strand. He first exhibited O'Keeffe's drawings in a group show in 1916, followed by a solo exhibition in 1917. And as Stieglitz and his circle sought to define an authentic American modernism, an authentic American identity, they looked toward cultivating a national spirit that was strictly derived from the American soil. And his relentless promotion of American art created a new appreciation and new markets for those works where none had previously existed. One of his earliest successes was with the painter John Marin, who lived from 1870 to 1953. Marin especially admired for his watercolors, like the two that you see here, both of the Brooklyn Bridge, a favorite motif of Marin's. Marin had met Stieglitz in 1909, so some years before these two works, and Stieglitz promoted him, but he promoted him to the extent that by the 1940s, Marin had achieved national fame. He drew his imagery from both the city and from the countryside, always seeking to capture an energy, not just the imagery. And although he experimented a little bit with non-objective compositions, he was never comfortable with complete abstraction. And I think even in these sort of flowing watercolors with their jagged edges and sort of sense of the energy of the city, you can still make out the Gothic arches of the Brooklyn Bridge. He moved to Maine and made the landscape of Maine one of his main subjects. This is one from the MFA's collection. I love that it's called Movement, Sea and Sky. He doesn't really tell you which one is which, and he doesn't really care to define rocks, sea, sky, clouds in any way that separates them from one another. But the energy and the gestural quality of Marin's work exerted an influence on other artists of his time, including the work of the young abstract expressionists. In the 1930s, as you can see in this particular work, Marin had started to work more extensively in oils, and we have several of them in our collection. Well, Marin was just one of the American modernists that Stieglitz promoted. This is the work of Marston Hartley, who lived from 1877 to 1943. Hartley was born in Lewiston, Maine. You've heard a lot about Lewiston, Maine this past month, since it's an anniversary of a bad happening in Lewiston. Maine was always Hartley's spiritual home, but he did come to New York, and he studied, like Georgia O'Keeffe did, with the American Impressionist painter William Merritt Chase. Hartley had his first ever show with Stieglitz in 1909. In 1912, he went to Europe and joined the community of modernists who were active in Paris, and then went to Berlin. He was in Berlin in the early teens, as you can see from these two pictures. The one on the left, a symbolic portrait of his lover, an officer in the German military, Karl von Freiberg, and the symbols of the German army are shown here in a sort of portrait that's made not by showing the person, but by showing objects that relate to that person's life. On the right, a painting called Arrangement Hieroglyphics, we see a lot of Native American motifs. And people always think, oh, he must have made that one in the United States. But he didn't. He made it in Berlin, inspired by the Native American objects that were in the Ethnographic Museum in Berlin, which has an enormous collection, a very early and important collection of Native American work. And Hartley took that as sort of a national idea of what American painting, American abstraction could be. And of course, now we would say, and would be wise to remember, that Native American artists had been doing abstractions from nature, as it is said, from time immemorial. Hartley comes back to the United States in 1916. He's considered a sort of suspect at that moment, since the First World War had broken out. He goes to work in New Mexico and also here in New England, and he goes back to Europe in the 1920s after the war was over. When he comes back to the United States, he starts devoting himself to scenes of the American landscape and the American people, like this one, which I particularly like. It's a view of Dogtown Common, a section, a sort of mysterious, weird part of Gloucester on Cape Ann, an abandoned settlement known for its giant granite boulders and the remains of houses that were no longer occupied, also said to be the hangout of strange happenings and witches. If you want to go there tomorrow, let me know. But you can see how Hartley takes on the landscape. Dogtown is really an odd geological formation, and it does have these big, oddly shaped boulders. But you can see that Hartley is playing with it, turning it into an abstraction worthy of a French artist that he particularly admired, Paul Cézanne. And Hartley often imbues his work with a sort of spirit, a symbolism, a feeling of anthropomorphism, if I can put it that way, that maybe these rocks might just move around by themselves. But the artist who I think is most closely linked to our exhibition project, the member of the Stieglitz Circle who is not O'Keeffe, is Arthur Dove. You see here on the left in a portrait Stieglitz made of him. He lived from 1880 to 1946. Dove grew up in a fairly wealthy upstate New York family. He went to Cornell. His parents were extremely disappointed in his decision to become an artist, and he did not support him during his career. They always felt that his Ivy League degree would have enabled him to earn his own living, and they were completely unsympathetic to the financial difficulties that came with being an artist and having a career in the arts. Dove went to Europe in 1907, as you can see with his still life of a lobster on the right. He was extremely influenced by the French artists, the Fauves, especially the works of Matisse. And when he came back from Europe, he met Stieglitz. He was then very quick to pick up abstraction. And these are among Dove's most amazing early works. 2 years after the lobster still life I just showed you, Dove was making pictures like these. These are pastels, and they're still based in the natural world, as you can see from the titles, Team of Horses on the left, and maybe these are the team of horses, or on the right, a painting in pastel called Nature Symbolized. He sought to represent the natural world in a way that captured its elements without representation. They're all based on natural forms, and he referred to this kind of abstraction, his kind of abstraction, as extraction, where in essence he pulled out what he found to be the essential forms, either of a scene or of a feeling or of a mood that he found in nature. Stieglitz gave Dove his first one-man show in 1912 at 291, and it included works like these. They've come to be called, and there's a series of them, the Ten Commandments. And it was the first public exhibition of abstract art by an American painter. Sometimes Dove's subjects are more recognizable, as you can see here, with Moon and Sea number 2, now at Crystal Bridges on your left, which to me captures not only the sea and the moon, but the sensation of a moonlit silver night. Or on the right, the animation, the lively animation that's even left in a piece of a dead tree trunk in the pastel on the right, which belongs to the MFA and which we've included in the exhibition. O'Keeffe and Dove were friends, and we've compared them in the context gallery within the exhibition. O'Keeffe on the left, Dove on the right, both of them looking at the sky from the beach overlooking the sea. From the outset of her career, O'Keeffe credited her introduction to modernism as deriving in part from the reproduction of one of those Ten Commandment pastels by Arthur Dove that she saw around 1913. The two artists deal with similar subjects. They capture the essence of nature, not only its appearance, but also the feel of the wind, the sense of water, the way water moves. Both of them employing sensual imagery and motifs that were sometimes interpreted to be sexual in nature. Both of them were tagged with Freudian interpretations in their own time. But let me just point out something that was as true in the 19th century as it was true for Dove and O'Keeffe. One critic called Dove's work virile and profound, and called O'Keeffe gloriously female, upholding stereotypes about women's work in the arts that have been employed for almost 100 years. I just want to point out that the MFA is rich in Dove's work. He was a particular favorite of the collector Bill Lane, and you can see two later works here. One of the signature pieces in our collection, Dove's That Red One, which gives you a completely abstract assemblage of forms and colors, but also it's a landscape. It's the sun coming up between trees. The second selection that I've made for showing you modernism I'm moving away from paintings now and going into sculpture. And I want to talk a little bit about Barbara Hepworth, who lived from 1903 to 1975. And you can see her here both at work in her own studio at the left and on the right with someone that she's always talked about with, somebody you may have heard of named Henry Moore, who you see here. He's in the center of that group of three. So Hepworth was closely connected to Moore. She was born in Yorkshire. She studied with Moore at the Leeds School of Art and then at the Royal College of Art in the 1920s. And the two of them were part of a circle of modern artists who worked in Hampstead in London. She early on moved to abstraction, and I'm showing you here from 1927 her view of a mother and child. When I went to the Art Gallery of Ontario with my co-curator Courtney to see Moore's work and to decide if we were going to borrow something from the AGO for our exhibition, and we did, and they were very generous, so let me just say thank you to them. I was taken with one case in their Henry Moore gallery, which you see here on the right, which is this piece, this Barbara Hepworth on the left, and a Henry Moore on the right. It's interesting to me, these are of the same date, more or less. It's Hepworth's that looks a little bit more abstract, and which, interestingly enough, in the context at the Art Gallery of Ontario, spoke to her interest in art, for example, like Inuit art, which is shown in such great profusion at the Art Gallery. So just as Moore moved out of London during the Second World War, when London is under bombardment, Moore moves to Perry Green, which we talk about in the exhibition. Hepworth and her husband Ben Nicholson moved to Cornwall, to St. Ives, where Hepworth would remain for the rest of her life. And I think you can see that she became more and more abstract as she went through her career. The mother and child motif that seems abstract but carefully defined in the sculpture on the left is now moving more into shapes and forms in the one that's just 3 years later on the right. Now, art historians love to argue with each other, and one of the big questions in the study of British modernist sculpture is who pierced the sculpture first? Was it Moore or was it Hepworth? And I'm in the Hepworth camp. I'm showing you a very early pierced form by Hepworth from 1932. Unfortunately, an example, if you can imagine pink alabaster, it must have been amazing, but it was destroyed during World War II and only survives in photographs. Hepworth worked in a variety of media. She had assistants like Moore did, and you can see here a piece made in wood, also with strings that connect different parts of the composition together, or the one on the right made out of bronze. She too, scaling up her work, thinking about what size it should be to best encompass her ideas. But I would also point out that Hepworth experienced something that has been experienced by women sculptors for years and years, which is it's hard to get big commissions. If you don't have a big commission, you don't have the money to cast an enormous thing in bronze. If you don't get a big commission, you don't get the visibility that an artist like Moore had. And I will tell you that Moore took a lot, was the beneficiary of so many commissions. And Hepworth started to do site-specific works, such as the one that you can see on the right, Conversation with Magic Stones, works that involve multiple pieces placed in juxtaposition to one another. They tend to be for gardens rather than for big urban public plazas, something that we also see in the whole history of women sculptors. Very rare to get an urban public commission, much more common to be asked to do a fountain for somebody's garden. I find though, that it's fascinating to look at Hepworth and Moore together, which is what we've done in the context gallery of our exhibition. And I'm very proud to say that Courtney and I fought to bring the MFA's great Hepworth out from outside, where it was sited next to the garden, inside to be in conversation in this exhibition to show that, yes, women do monumental public sculpture in bronze. And I love this rock form, Porthcurno, which was inspired by the cliffs at the seaside near where Hepworth lived. The third medium I wanted to talk about in terms of modernism is photography. And in this case, I want to talk about a group that's been called F64. It doesn't stand for something that you might think. F64 is actually a particular aperture on a camera. So this is a group of 7 20th century California artists who shared a common photographic style that was characterized by very sharply focused and carefully framed images. And that stop, F64, is one that gives you that sharp focus. Unlike most of the artists I've been talking about, these artists really were California-based, and they show a different kind of America than the ones who were active in New York and New England. The two artists I want to talk about are Imogen Cunningham and Edward Weston. Let me just point out that the photographic portrait of Weston on the left is not a self-portrait. It was made by Imogen Cunningham, giving you an idea of the closeness and friendship-related relationships that these photographers all had. Both Weston and Cunningham started at a different place in their photographic careers. Both of them were what's considered pictorialist photographers. In other words, photographers who played into the conventions of fine art, often using figurative subjects, sometimes still lifes, softly focused as if they were made by hand. That pictorialist school was more quickly accepted as fine art than straight photography was. And as I said, it was Stieglitz's battle to have straight photography recognized for its artistic characteristics and its really position as fine art. But Cunningham and Weston both started here very, what you might call conventionally for anybody who, it's hard to say that being a pictorialist photographer was conventional at all, since being a fine art photographer was not a conventional choice, but they quickly moved to a different place. So here is Weston, born in Chicago, settles in California in his early 20s, specializes in landscapes and still lifes, also does a beautiful series of nudes, which I'm not going to talk to you about today, but which I think some of you will remember from the series of Weston photographic exhibitions we've had in the past. And we've included 2 of his nature-based abstractions in the exhibition. Well, we've included these 2. We've included about 10 Weston photographs in the show. Weston would come to say that, and I quote, "I feel definite in the belief that the approach to photography is through realism." But let's talk for a minute about what that means. I think we'd have to agree that Weston offers a pretty carefully curated vision of realism. It is formal, it is abstract, it is carefully lit, arranged, selected, framed. A very different definition of what we might call realism from a photographer, for example, who chose to show the urban social realist scene of, for example, the slums of New York. So Weston is realistic, but if I can use a word that I actually hate, very curated. I can say that, I'm a curator. Weston has a very special place at the Museum of Fine Arts, and I would be negligent if I didn't point that out to you. With the great legacy of Bill and Sandra Lane, we own about 2,500 photographs by Weston. Cunningham was from the West Coast. She was born in Portland. She grew up in Seattle. She attended the University of Washington and got a degree in chemistry, not because she was particularly interested in becoming a chemist, but because that was the only way that she found in order to nurture her strong, long interest in photography. And those of you who have ever stood in a dark room and made a photograph will know how important chemistry is in that process. She worked for a while in the studio of Edward Curtis, who took a whole series of images of Native Americans over the course of the late 19th and early 20th century. Curtis was known for his use of different kinds of photographic techniques. So he was a place where you could really learn what's the difference between a platinum print, a print that's been done in a gel and silver medium, all the different techniques of photography she could learn in Curtis's studio. She was serious. She then went to Germany to study photography, which was one of the only places you could do that at that point, and I should mention that Stieglitz did that too. And she perfected her mastery of producing in the darkroom platinum prints, and the platinum prints are among her most beautiful. In 1917, she settled in California, but by then her work was already being shown in New York. And I think you'll agree from these two images, completely different subjects, that her formal concerns were aligned no matter what she was taking a picture of. Here on the left, one of her more famous images of a calla lily, which has all the curves and shadows and might as well be the form of the nude on the right from the way she saw it. This is one of the comparisons that we've included in the exhibition, Weston on the left and Cunningham on the right. You might think that the Weston is a flower bud, but in fact it's whale teeth. No, I didn't know that whales had teeth like that, but I believe it. It looks remarkably similar to Cunningham's image of a magnolia bud. And again, it's the placement, it's the lighting, it's the sharp focus on these forms that bring them into conversation with each other. What was interesting for me, and sort of a revelation as we did the exhibition, was what happened when we put those pictures together with O'Keeffe's very early sculpture from 1916, which you see here. If you remember that O'Keeffe charcoal, no, you can't remember it. I haven't shown it to you. Sorry. I have another lecture tonight, and it's in that one. O'Keeffe in 1916 did a number of very abstract charcoal drawings that included these great sort of swooping forms. And she made a sculpture, this one, that's related to those drawings. Many people have interpreted this sculpture as O'Keeffe's sort of memorial and expression of grief at the time of the death of her mother. And it's been read that way in biographical terms by many scholars and many individuals. I have to say, I find it interesting that women's works are so often read in biographical terms and very often associated with family and with emotion. When I put that sculpture next to the Weston photograph, I saw it entirely differently. Perhaps not an expression of grief, but perhaps an expression of hope. It looks like a bud to me, like something growing, like something that gives us a very different idea than simply a moment of grief. And I'm saying all that to you because I want you to keep your minds open. There's no wrong way to look at these things, And I think in a way it speaks very much to the nature of modernism, where different interpretations, different kinds of work, that's part of modernism itself. It's very variety and different modes of perception. I hope that our time together today has given you some sense of the context in which these two artists made their works, Moore on the left, O'Keeffe on the right, and also of their place within a very large world of what we call modernism. There are indeed multiple modernisms, but I think O'Keeffe and Moore offer us a special moment of what I've been calling visual poetry. I'm going to leave you with one thought, which is that the other thing that I think the exhibition does and that the works of many of these artists do is to remind us that if we keep our eyes open, we can find art in the world all around us. And yes, I took that photograph in Acadia last week, and if you keep your eyes open, there's art all around us, and something that I think refreshes and sustains us. Thank you. For those of you in the room, I'm happy to answer questions if you have them and if I can.
Great. We have microphones on either side. Here we go. It's a little loud.
I'm not sure if this is correct, but I Googled quickly the relationship between Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth, and Google told me that Henry Moore at one point kept Barbara Hepworth from being able to have an exhibition at the Tate.
Okay, who wrote the Google thing? I'm going to go find it. The thing I've learned is that Google is an amazing tool, but you have to know who made the tool. And you can read whatever you want on the internet, which is, I'm sorry, I think it's part of the problem we're all facing. And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know that Moore would have done that, to tell you the truth, from what I've learned about him over the course of this exhibition. I can believe that Tate would have chosen a male artist to feature over a female artist at that moment. That I can believe. But without knowing your source, I can't really comment on that. Anybody else? Yes, down front. It's for the folks who are listening online, if you wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Quite a few years ago, I saw an exhibit of O'Keeffe and Dove at the Clark Art Institute, and I had the impression that she was influenced by Dove, but then Dove became influenced by her.
This question of influence is really an interesting one, because we've been grappling with it with O'Keeffe and Moore, because, you know, people always say, well, why O'Keeffe and Moore? And I said myself, why not Moore and Hepworth? I think it's very difficult when artists know each other or are in the same circumstance to figure out who's first, who does things first. O'Keeffe said herself that early on she was influenced by Dove. So I think we can believe that since she said it. And you know, there are similarities between their work, but I think more Dove's work really just develops also over time. It tends to look a little bit like O'Keeffe's in terms of it develops a more graphic quality. I think you saw in that red one, for example, that it's very, if I can even go back to it. They get very graphic, if you will, more bright, more linear in a way, and those are certainly characteristics of a lot of O'Keeffe's work. I'm not sure it's a matter of influence, but a matter of the moment that they're in when a lot of artists get more graphic, more colorful. The thing that I find interesting is that they're both very painterly. These look like posters on the screen, but when you go see that red one, you'll see how finely feathered the brush strokes are, which is something that you see also in O'Keeffe if you see them up close. So maybe he was influenced by her. Dove had an interesting life. He lived mostly, for many years on a houseboat in Huntington Harbor, and then he lived in Centerport, Long Island. He dies early. He's quite ill at the end of his life, so he doesn't participate in the art world as much after the mid-1940s. Yes, but 2 questions down here.
Hi, thank you for this lecture. I'm wondering about the origin, if you know about how did the idea of this pairing come about and how the pieces were selected?
Okay, well, you're going to have to come to a different lecture for that. Yes, I can tell you that the exhibition that you see in the Gun Gallery was organized by the San Diego Museum of Art. It was on view there last summer, and then it traveled to Albuquerque, to Montreal, and Boston is the final venue. The idea was San Diego's. Their chief curator, a woman named Anita Feldman, had worked for the Moore Foundation for 18 years before she came to San Diego. So she was extremely, and is extremely knowledgeable about Moore's work, and she was very struck when she went to the O'Keeffe Museum and to O'Keeffe Studios in New Mexico at the way in which these 2 artists saw nature as a way to get to their art. Both of them were great walkers. Both of them were great, I don't want to say great collectors because then you think they're buying Matisse, but great collectors in the way I'm a great collector. I walk on the beach and I pick up shells. They walked in their landscape and picked up things that then turned into inspiration for their compositions in either sculpture or painting. So Anita was very struck by that and very much wanted to bring them together in that conversation. And she navigated the loans with the O'Keeffe Museum and the Henry Moore Foundation, who are the major lenders to the exhibition. We reinvented the show for Boston. Not reinvented, it's Anita's show. We organized it somewhat differently and added a number of works from our own collection because we have such a strong collection of American modernism, and we wanted to give that bigger picture of where the worlds in which O'Keeffe and Moore were artistically. So we did bring in Weston, Hepworth, Siri Richards, Calder, Arp, to show that there is a whole moment in the mid-20th century where artists are looking at nature to create abstraction. So that's the big difference between the traveling exhibition and what you see here, aside from the fact that we have, some different themes, and but basically it's San Diego's show. Does that answer your question? Absolutely, thank you.
Hi there. Could you comment on the relationship of Georgia O'Keeffe and Stieglitz?
I can comment on the relationship between O'Keeffe and Stieglitz, Alfred Stieglitz. She made these abstract charcoal drawings and sent them to a friend in New York, and it was the friend who brought them to Stieglitz, who, without O'Keeffe's permission, I might add, and Stieglitz was bowled over by them and wanted to show them. So he was first attracted by her work. He encourages her to go to New York, and they begin a fairly torrid love affair. They marry in 1924. Many of you will know Stieglitz's series of photographs of O'Keeffe. The nudes are the best known. Let me just tell you, there are a lot of them, and they aren't all nude. But you know what gets famous and what doesn't. And they were married until Stieglitz died in 1946. Stieglitz was known to have a number of affairs. It wasn't necessarily the smoothest relationship. She also is kind of in and out of the New York scene. She makes wonderful paintings of New York, which some of you might have seen. There's a show called O'Keeffe's New Yorks that's now at the High Museum in Atlanta, organized by the Art Institute of Chicago. So she's in New York. She sees the shows at MoMA. She exhibits at Stieglitz's gallery. She uses New York as her subject. She paints her earliest bone pictures in New York. She ships them back from New Mexico and paints them in New York. But more and more she's drawn to the Southwest and to a more solitary existence that she feels she needs to create her best work. And after Stieglitz dies and she settles his estate, she moves permanently to New Mexico. Does that answer your question? One more. Or maybe two more if there's two. I don't know.
I've seen the exhibition twice, and I'm really struck by the variety of artists you brought in, which is so apropos to understanding these two artists. Instead of being confusing, it's actually very enriching. My question is about George O'Keeffe's painting style. And I don't know the size of, is Dove, all of his work approximately the same size, or?
So for Dove often works out his designs in watercolor on paper before he does an oil painting, and we call them the dovelets because they're this big. They're like postcards, and they're fantastic. And then he would choose and work one up into a painting that's
Yeah.
the kind you can carry around. It's
So,
more or less the size of an impressionist painting, the kinds of paintings that you can carry around.
So
And
you
he
meant,
worked on a houseboat, so
Oh,
remember that.
wow, I didn't know that.
Some of
So-
them are smaller. There are a few that are larger, but they're mostly of a size.
So I think it's interesting when you mentioned the brushstrokes, which we can vaguely see. I'd love to see that painting up close. But I'm wondering more about George O'Keeffe. When I first saw the first paintings of the skulls, my eyes said watercolor. Can you explain her technique to have this almost transparency of the oil that we don't see from a lot of other artists? And her palette range in general is a limited palette.
So she is a meticulous craftsperson. Let me just start there. She does work in watercolor. I mentioned, I think, there was a wonderful exhibition called O'Keeffe on Paper at MoMA last year that just had amazing works by O'Keeffe in watercolor. So it's a medium she uses and is very familiar with. The oils, she draws on the canvas first. She tests out her colors on card, and you can see those color cards in the studio section of the exhibition where she's working out the mixture. She doesn't mix on canvas. She mixes it all ahead of time and tests it out. So she's very, very controlled. And then when she gets to the point where she knows what she's going to do, she does it very, very carefully. We don't know as much about how she actually puts paint on canvas except what we learned from conservators, because she didn't let people watch her paint. In my conversations with the conservator from the O'Keeffe Museum who came to help install this exhibition, I had no idea that she drew in pencil on the canvas underneath. You can only see it if you x-ray them. So the application in general is thin and careful.
Okay, I think we'll end
Thank you so
there.
much.